Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. Just got back from Ange Postecoglou's Tottenham press conference ahead of an absolutely massive game against Eintracht Frankfurt. The first leg of the quarter-final in the Europa League. The whole season boils down to this, let's be honest. After an absolutely dreadful season in the league, out of both cup competitions, obviously they went far in the Carabao Cup but ultimately didn't win it. Out pretty in the FA Cup. The way to save the season is through the Europa League, but it's not going to be easy because it's Eintracht Frankfurt and they're a decent team. It was quite a, what's the word, testy? Fiery maybe? Press conference with Ange. Sparked quite early on. Often the way with Ange, I feel like someone can ask a question that perhaps he doesn't quite like, and it's often a little bit later on that you really see the sort of effect of it, where he starts to get a bit tetchier, I suppose. And it happened quite early on today where he was asked about to Arsenal fans last night singing "Are You Tottenham in Disguise" towards Real Madrid, which is effectively sort of taking the mick out of Spurs, which obviously Arsenal, being arch rivals, enjoy doing, and whether it's time to sort of shake off the whipping boys tag. And his answer to that was quite short, but then his answer to the next question was pretty snappy, and I wonder if that was kind of, began from that original first question, which he didn't particularly like. I'll get on to that point. Well, actually, let's get into it now, actually. So my colleague Dan Kilpatrick from the Evening Standard, who I do the Tottenham Way podcast with, asked him about Brennan Johnson and the whole penalty incident after the Southampton game, which I admit I didn't really touch on in my post-match video after that game, because ultimately Spurs won the game, Southampton got relegated, they scored that penalty. Didn't really see it as that much of a flashpoint, but basically Johnson was on it was on a hat-trick, wasn't he? He won the penalty, obviously wanted to take this penalty, and it's Matisse Tell who ends up taking it and scoring it. And it seems like from his post-match interview, he was a bit disappointed. He would have wanted to take it himself, but that was basically it. And Ange was asked by Dan whether, about that incident and what he felt about it. And Ange's response to that was, he said it was incredible how the quote was effectively, with Tottenham, gold can be turned into crap, i.e. Even the good moments with Spurs can often be sort of twisted by critics, by other people, wider media, I guess, into a negative. And it was sort of pushing back on that, and sort of kind of kept continuing the theme that we had last week about where he talked about how he feels like he's a bit of a lone voice. There isn't really anyone else really speaking up for the club, not just internally but externally when talking about pundits in the game, not really sort of speaking up for Spurs like he feels other clubs do, specifically Liverpool, it felt like, what we were saying last week. I mean, one thing I would say to that, it's quite difficult to speak up for Tottenham this season from a league campaign point of view because it's been going so badly, but that's sort of by the by. But yeah, he was kind of chippy on that particular question. But then he was quite interesting. I mean, I followed up on that point with a question of my own, saying essentially this if I can sort of sense quite a lot of anger with this sort of summed up by this sort of gold into crap comment, but how sort of angry is the dressing room really, and how much do they want to, how much is that they're using that effectively as fuel to show everyone that they're still a good team, that they still have it's not all been a disaster this season, and they can turn it into gold after a poor campaign. And in this sort of answer, which he sort of went on, he was quite lengthy in his response to that. I mean, first of all, he said he doesn't feel like it's the right way to. Ultimately, he said he doesn't really feel like that's the right kind of motivation for the team, because it's an argument you're never going to win. And within that answer, and it was followed up later, he essentially said that the general sentiment out there is that even if they win, with it out there as in within the footballing world, is even if they win the Europa League, he's going to be gone. He's going to be out of a job. And he sort of referenced my colleague John Cross from the Mirror, an article he wrote last week. I think it was essentially the match report after the Chelsea game, where we had the flashpoint with in the ear cupping, which he obviously denied, was winding up the Spurs fans, but it felt like quite a moment. And I think in John's match report, he sort of essentially said it's going to be quite hard to come back from this. Anyway, I talked about Troy Deeney's column the other day, talking about how he was making the case that even if Ange wins the Europa League, he should go. But essentially these are just opinion pieces rather than definite fact that he will be gone. But obviously there's a lot of talk at the moment about whether his position and whether he's going to stay in a job. But it was just quite interesting to hear him pick up on it and sort of suggest that he's aware of this general sentiment, as he put it, that around the game, that he might go even if they do win the Europa League, which definitely was a big news line for us guys in the newspapers. It's definitely something that we led on, and if you read the newspapers tomorrow, you'll see a lot of articles talking about that, about how Ange made that specific point, which was interesting, and continued a theme of Ange speaking in a way about the uncertainty over his job in a way that you don't often get with managers, even under pressure. I mean, we've had before him talking about the outstanding candidates if he were to leave the job. His comments last week about the issues that Spurs face, which kind of echoed Conte a little bit, how changing the manager won't really change anything. And when you hear him speak, I mean, Ange is he's different to a lot of managers, even if he was echoing Conte's point there, where he just often comes across, to me at least, as quite authentic and quite honest. And through that, lines emerge, and lines I mean as in journalistic sort of, we're looking for a fascinating line, an interesting point that he makes that we can write about. I suppose comments emerge that maybe other managers just wouldn't go down, and this was another example of it. But anyway, to sort of use his quote about people turning gold into crap when it comes to Tottenham. I mean, let's be honest, this season, at least from a league point of view, has been crap. And so now it's the chance to turn that into gold via the Europa League. And that remains, as it always has been throughout the season, the possibility of a saving grace, albeit even if he thinks that the general sentiment out there is that it wouldn't be a saving grace for him personally, even if he did win the competition. I think that's definitely still up for debate. If he can go on and become the first manager in 17 years to win a trophy, and not only that, a European trophy, which I think would be the first time since 1984, then there's definitely a case for keeping him on, and maybe it would be very difficult for the club to move on from him. And there's a chance to sort of turn it around, but there's a hell of a lot to come before that's even a possibility. And let's be honest, the way Spurs are playing against the Frankfurt side, who aren't sort of invincible by any stretch, but going fairly well in the Bundesliga, is going to be difficult. What else did he talk about? He talked about the importance of the home fans today, and how he actually kind of referenced Arsenal in a way. He said we've seen in Europe and last night, i.e. the Arsenal game, how having a big atmosphere can play a vital role in a team's sort of success chances, and sort of calling on the Spurs fans to effectively do the same thing in this game tomorrow. And I really hope they do. I know a lot of fans seem to be very angry, obviously, with the ownership, and a lot of them seem to have lost faith in Postecoglou, which he himself has said in that interview with Mark Schwarzer. But ultimately, the season comes down to this. There's not very often they're in a quarterfinal of a European competition, and everyone will know that they can play a vital role in roaring on the team, I suppose. The opposite of what we saw at Southampton, which was understandable, Premier League game against a poor opposition where the league position doesn't really mean anything. I can understand the sort of eerie, quiet, strange atmosphere in that game, but you'd hope it'd be very, very different for this game. And we've seen already this season where the fans, and in Postecoglou's tenure, where the fans can make an absolutely pivotal difference, like Liverpool, the first leg in the Carabao Cup, even if semi-final, even if they ultimately got thrashed in the second leg. Spurs fans played a big role in that. And one thing, with Frankfurt, having been there a couple of years ago with Tottenham in the Champions League group stage, is that atmosphere at Frankfurt is going to be deafening. They're going to be behind their team all the way, and if it's the second leg, I've mentioned this a few times, I'm worried about it being the second leg, being away from home, then that they really need to go into that game with some sort of lead, and the fans can play a big part of that. It was quite interesting about players. Brennan Johnson in particular, because Brennan Johnson was up for press, and I'll come on to some of his comments in a minute. But about how he's been in and out of the team. He obviously hadn't been played as much recently, but then his 2 goals and very good performance, to be honest, against Southampton, coupled with Odegaard not looking as good when he came off the bench, and actually Ange kind of slightly criticising him, to be honest, for not being quite ready in time, suddenly makes you think, has Johnson got a good chance of starting against Frankfurt? And he was basically saying with Johnson, it's been about trying to get all these other players who are coming back from long-term injury, ready for this game, effectively, for the Europa League, and being in a position where he could have just played Johnson the whole time, but Odegaard would be really, really undercooked. We've talked before, about whether that was the right strategy, given back when they lost at home to Man City and he played Odegaard, that was a right team selection. I don't know. At the time, I was a bit critical of it. But anyway, that's where he's at. That's the sort of approach he's taken. And now you'd hope going into this game, players like Odegaard, Van de Ven, others who come back from long-term injury are in a position where hopefully they are, if not firing all cylinders, feel fit enough to make an impact. And so that's how he was sort of explaining it. On to Johnson. I mean, he was interesting about his own season. He feels very proud of his 16 goals. I mean, his return is very, very good. And we're having a bit of a sort of debate amongst the other reporters about whether effectively he's a flat track bully or not, as harsh as that might sound. I am in the camp of thinking maybe he is a bit. Does seem to score goals against weaker opposition, or if it's better opposition, it's in moments that aren't as crucial. But having said that, he's actually scored quite a lot of game-changing goals, particularly last season, when games are being turned around. So maybe that's harsh. I don't know. Depends. Be interested to see what you guys think about Johnson on that front. He certainly took his goals fantastically well against Southampton. He was quite interesting about his whole technique, all that stuff about what he's been working on with the players, with the coaching staff, and how hard it was over the sort of winter period where they were down at times, having sort of 10 or 11 players out, and how proud he felt of the team really sort of coping with that. But ultimately, I think the most interesting line from Johnson was about how he's not really caring about what the critics and the other fans are saying or singing, like the Arsenal fans were taking the mick out of Spurs fans last night, or Tottenham generally last night. I mean, it really does feel like Spurs' critics this season have had a bit of a field day, haven't they? It's been very easy for people, if you want to laugh at Tottenham, given how poorly they've done in the Europa League, in the Premier League. To the point where questions about relegation even cropped up at one point. And whether that's sort of motivating the players to sort of show they are a serious team and to sort of not be taking the piss out of, I suppose, given how poorly it's gone. But he pushed back on that. He said he didn't care about. A long time ago, he sort of stopped caring about the critics, and he sort of painted this picture of this sort of band of brothers that have emerged this season. To be honest, amongst difficult times, tough times with every player at times getting criticised, and how he wants to do it for them. The team wants to do it for themselves effectively, this Europa League run, and he felt pretty genuine with the way he said it. So yeah, I guess it will be fascinating to see if he starts, how the team respond on what is really an absolutely monumental game for Spurs this season, and specifically Postecoglou. We all know about the talk of other managers. I mean, today there was another mention in the German press, Bill talking about Oliver Glasner at Crystal Palace, whose future seems a bit in doubt anyway. There's a lot of talk about RB Leipzig, but there was mention of Spurs. My understanding is there hasn't been a sort of contact between the club. They've got a manager at the moment, at least it seems to be the sort of official line on that front. But, let's be honest, right now it's still all about Postecoglou and whether he can turn it around. Frankfurt, they're third in the Bundesliga, as I said, which sounds ominous, but they're actually, when you look at the league table, they're well off second. Bayern and Leverkusen are really far ahead of everyone. Their form is patchy, I'd say. I think it's 4 defeats in the last 8. I think that's 4 of those defeats come in the last 6 league games. So they're not, as I said, not invincible. They actually thrashed Ajax in the last round, which shows their quality. But ever since they sold, unsurprisingly, Omar Mamouche to Man City in January, one of many recent good bits of selling business from the club, they're not quite the same side as they were, but they do have a top young striker in Hugo Ekitike up front. They picked him up from PSG when he was struggling, PSG having beaten Newcastle to signing him a few years ago. Didn't really get much of a look in there, but he seems to be flourishing at Frankfurt to the point where it sounds like Arsenal generally are looking at him. And you know, the other players that sort of caught my eye looking at squads, Mario Götze. I mean, Bradley Johnson was 13 when Götze was winning the World Cup with or scoring the winning goal in the World Cup final back in 2014. Michy Batshuayi, the old Palace and Chelsea player, is at Frankfurt as well. And they're a team that know what it's like to go all the way in this competition. They won it back in 2022 under Oliver Glasner, where they beat Rangers in the final on penalties. So it is going to be tough, and I do really feel like this home leg, Spurs have got to go about getting a lead. And to be honest, looking at that Liverpool game, although Liverpool are obviously a much better team than Frankfurt, it seems like it's important that it's not just a 1-goal lead going into the second leg. So it's hard to pull form out of nowhere. Having said that, I thought their last good performance, really good performance, I think, was AZ Alkmaar in the second leg at home. The pressure was on. They were so bad in that first leg. Yes, it's AZ Alkmaar, so that should be sort of come into it. But they were so bad in that first leg, and they were 1-0 down. They had to turn it around, and they managed it, and I thought they were very good. So they need to sort of replicate that, but onto another level with Frankfurt. And show that they still have this fight, this quality in their team, which they have struggled to show most of the season. So I guess finally, just looking at the team, suddenly over these last few weeks, suddenly his sort of first choice 11 is becoming easier to pick than it has done in recent months, and that's not just because of injuries, just because I feel like there have been a lot of sort of toss-ups between certain players. But now, Vicario in goal, I think it's Porro and Spence is probably his favoured fullbacks, albeit Udogie has been sort of almost brought back, it seems, at times to play in this tie, whether it's this game. But I think on form, Spence probably edges Udogie, Van der Ven and Romero, obviously. And then the midfield is relatively easy. I don't think Sarr comes into it. I think it's Bentancur, Maddison, Bergvall. The main question for me is Brennan Johnson or Wilson Odobert, wide right with Solanke and Son up front. I mean, just on Solanke, he feels like he has struggled since coming back from injury. Looks far less of a goal threat. So let's hope that can change in this game, because they really need their talisman, who, when he's playing well, has looked value for money, I think, even at 65 million. But as the season wears on and his goal return isn't great, and it's not so much that, it's just I don't feel like he's been as effective in recent games as that has in his hold-up play. Question marks are sort of creeping into him as well, really. But look, the question marks around his whole team and the manager, obviously, given how it's going. This is a chance, really, to answer some of those questions and change that narrative that Ange has been bemoaning the last few weeks. It's on the team to do it. It always is with football. It's on the team to change the narrative by putting in good results. And we know individually they can do it. Can they do it as a team? Let's see. I'll speak to you guys after the game. Let me know your thoughts. Cheers.